Jeremy spoke in class today, and he wouldn't shut up about how much he loved the Stick to Wrestling podcast. Hello, everyone. My name's John McAdam, and we are here to deliver a wicked good podcast for you. Give us 60 minutes, and we will give you an outstanding podcast. Once again, it is all my fault. It's not Sean Goodwin's fault that he is not here this week. Sean was ready. He was where he was supposed to be, when he was supposed to be there, ready to record, and I wasn't. I had an absolutely crazy situation blow up at work, and I could not record during a weeknight. And Sean's the smart one. He's off somewhere with his girl on this beautiful late summer day. So I have brought in David Bixenspan as my co-host for this week. David, how are you again?
I'm doing good again. It feels like I haven't talked to you in forever.
I know, it's been a while. We're not going to kid you. We are recording part 2 of 1984, the summer of 1984, on the same day that we did the first one. And this wraps up our summer series. Before we get into that, I want to invite every person listening to this to join and participate in our Facebook group. All you have to do is put in the word Stick to Wrestling, and you'll be able to find it on Facebook. Also, if you would like to follow me on Twitter, just put in the words John McAdam. You'll see the chair fight. Bang, hit the follow. I will warn you that I don't stick to wrestling. Sometimes I talk wrestling a lot, but you'll get football, baseball, humor, whatever. David, we're getting back to the summer of 1984, which is 35 years ago. Let's head over to Mid-South Wrestling, the biggest story. Junkyard Dog jumps to the WWF after being Mid-South's top guy for like 4 or 5 years. Now that in and of itself is a huge story. But what makes it even bigger is that Bill Watts goes on TV and he shows clips of Junkyard Dog getting beat up by Butch Reed, getting beat up by Ernie Ladd, getting tar and feathered by Butch Reed and Buddy Landel. And Watts says that Junkyard Dog snapped and he conceded his feud to Butch Reed. He basically ran away from Butch Reed, and he went to go wrestle somewhere where the competition was not as tough. We're in a wrestling war officially now, kids. Bix, your thoughts on JYD jumping to the WWF, leaving Mid-South high and dry?
So was JYD the first person Watts did that with showing the old matches revoiced over on Power Pro? Or had that happened earlier, like with Tito or people like that?
He hadn't done it as I don't remember him doing it with Tito, but I remember him doing it with of all people, Paul Orndorff in 1982. Orndorff, had his run through Mid-South. He'd been there for like 2 years, starting in 1980. He went to WTBS, immediately became the national heavyweight champion. And Watts gets on, and he's like, wow, well, Bob Roop ran Paul Orndorff out of here, and Orndorff's the number one guy in Georgia. The competition must not be too hot there. And I think he had points in Georgia, too.
But, he starts doing a lot, though. And, mainly on Power Pro. He wasn't wasting his time on his main show with it, usually. He was usually saying that these old arena matches were new arena matches, like the other ones he was showing on Power Pro. And it wasn't exactly believable. If you're like, I would think even the densest fan would realize that the Iron Sheik or JYD or Tito Santana or whoever were not coming back from the WWF to do a one-off.
No.
And it felt like a bit much. Ole had been doing he hadn't been revoicing over old matches, but he had been doing, kind of the precursor to what WCW would do a decade later, with their Where the Big Boys Play clips of guys getting beat up when they were in the promotion that are in WWF. So Watts isn't the first person to do anything like that, but his was the most egregious and the most, how would I put this? Straining credulity in the way he handled it. That said, I can get why he was upset at JYD to the degree of wanting to do that, because JYD didn't give his notice and he was his top star, and Watts had given him a superstar push when he was green, and had been pushed other places, but had not been a star yet, and made him rich, et cetera, et cetera. So I see where he was coming from, even if I don't think it was effective. And from JYD's perspective, you would think the guy probably should have at least given his notice. I wonder if he thought getting away from being in New Orleans all the time would help his bad habits, when it turns out that the different travel probably made it worse. But I look at JYD mainly as a sympathetic figure, just because, by all accounts, a wonderful guy. The money issues were a mix of the drugs and apparently him having kind of a soft touch as far as if friends or family needed money. The whole thing, where his daughter had died, clearly. Wait, was it his daughter? No, it was his sister. Who was it? His sister died. I believe.
I know his daughter died, but I'm not sure when that happened.
It was his daughter died, and I think his sister also was having some issues with mental illness. Was that it? Something like that?
Perhaps, I'm not sure.
But he had so much going. I don't really fault the guy for too much, just because he was going through a lot of shit in that era.
Yeah.
But as far as business wise, I can see why he made the move. He had been there for 5 years, and he was getting kind of phased down. Not exactly, but the Memphis guys were really becoming the real top baby faces in most of the promotion. So I can see why he'd want to leave. But you would hope the guy would give his notice, and I think that's what angered Watts the most.
And, it maybe Junkyard Dog was done as a draw in New Orleans, Arkansas, Mississippi, etc. Maybe he was already done, because I heard from someone that was there that when he lost to Mr. Wrestling 2, that killed him. But, I mean, if Watts goes on
TV, the fans thought he took a dive because the knee lift didn't land right.
Yeah, that's true. But I think Dog was never a draw for the WWF in his traditional Mid-South territory.
Nope.
And Watts wanted that, and Watts did something to at least help make that happen.
That's definitely true. But he had already been going down enough that I don't know if it would have mattered that much, because it had already gotten to the point even before. Well, actually, no, wait, I'm thinking of the timeline wrong. But he still had some drawing power in New Orleans, but he really had been surpassed by everyone else in the rest of the territory.
Yeah, and if you're Junkyard Dog and Vince McMahon's on the phone saying, "Hey, come in," Dog had to know that Watts knew that his best days, Dog's best days in Mid-South were behind him. He had already kind of tried to push Hacksaw Jim Duggan ahead of him, and by that point, it was like, who was Mid-South number one babyface? Was it Duggan or Dog? It was like 1 and 1A. And to me, it looked obvious that Watts had his sights on Butch Reed someday being that number one babyface. If you're Dog, you've got to be looking elsewhere, to be honest with you. And he was already appearing in Mid-Atlantic. He had already made a few appearances for World Class. He had appeared in Florida. So he was kind of already on his way out, I think.
Yeah, he'd become a touring attraction, so it's not like he was there all the time anyway. So, the thing is, though, I don't know where as far as looking for a full-time spot, I don't know if anywhere would have worked for him other than the WWF. And, Vince is going to demand not giving his notice, which most guys went along with, because most wrestlers hated all the other promoters. I gotta think there's more than just Heenan who actually did give their notices. Heenan was the only one going out of the AWA that gave his notice, but I gotta think there are other people that we just don't realize that gave notices to their home promotions before leaving. But I gotta think there's at least somewhat less resentment in general if that isn't happening so much.
I think Valentine gave his notice. I think Piper gave his notice. Of course, we're talking
Yes,
about
Valentine definitely did. Yes, and Piper, I believe, did too, but he didn't work out a long notice the way that Valentine did.
Okay, I know Piper didn't get jobbed out on his way out like Valentine did, but I mean, everyone's got to do what's best for themselves. I know Vince McMahon was telling the wrestlers, "Don't worry about this guy being mad at you. He's going to be out of the business in a couple of years." And in a lot of the cases, Vince was right.
Yeah, and Valentine, even though he was getting jobbed out, though he had been turned babyface, so that was going to get undone once he went to WWF. So I'm guessing he was fairly okay with it since he was going to be refreshed again anyway, in a few ways.
Very true. I mean, this is in summer of '84. What did you think of Greg Valentine as a babyface in Mid-Atlantic?
I have not watched the Boogie Jam show that went up on WWE Network yet, so I haven't seen. Who is it? I think it's Slater that he works with on that. So I haven't seen that yet. But from the stuff I have seen, I thought he was surprisingly effective as a babyface. Like, you would never imagine until you see it, but I think part of it is just that Greg Valentine was so much more dynamic than Crockett anyway. I don't think the WWF Greg Valentine past like 86 could have ever been a babyface. So, I mean, I don't know if the WWF Greg Valentine ever could have been a babyface, but he went on a slide after that anyway. But
he was a babyface for a little while in the WWF. I want to say in 1990, 1991.
Effective babyface, I should say.
Okay.
But I thought he worked quite well. Maybe part of that was having the right opponents too, but you watch the Ernie Ladd match from, I think it was the TV title tournament. He is incredibly over with that crowd at the TV tape. Like, to a degree you wouldn't believe, but I mean, he had been a heel in that territory for years, so he'd been around. So it does make sense that once he turned babyface, the crowd would be into it. The more heat you have as a heel, the more over he'll eventually be as a babyface. So to finally be a babyface on his way out after, 7 years, something like that. I totally get that someone as good a worker as he would get over to the degree he was.
I think he debuted in Mid-Atlantic fall of 1976. So, yeah, he'd been, in and out of the territory, but that was kind of his homestead. So, yeah, that means he'd been there for over 7 years, or he had debuted over 7 years earlier, and the time had come. I mean, excuse me. I think Valentine, I think it could have worked. I have been surprised by guys who have turned. Like, I never thought Barry, for whatever reason, I never thought Barry Windham would have been a good heel. Wrong. He was a great heel. Brutus Beefcake, I never thought that was going to get over. It got over. It got over big time. Valentine, off the top of my head, because I'd never really seen it before, I don't think would have been an effective babyface. But like you said, I mean, he was over that brief time in Mid-Atlantic, so who knows?
Yeah, sometimes you can't see it coming. I don't think it probably works as well without him having that tenure going into it, though.
Good point. But all right, moving on with Mid-South. The single greatest feud I have ever seen kind of came to an end right around summer of 1984. It was Magnum TA against Mr. Wrestling 2. And yeah, I am not using hyperbole. It is the best feud I've ever seen. The feud goes like this. Magnum TA is kind of a mid-card star in Mid-South, takes Mr. Wrestling 2 as who is a babyface as his mentor. TA gets better quickly under Mr. Wrestling 2 and is named the #1 contender for the North American title. He's supposed to get a match against Junkyard Dog. Well, guess who gets jealous of his own protege, Mr. Wrestling 2. By the way, speaking of a guy who I'd never seen as a heel and didn't know if he was going to be a good heel, he was a great heel. And eventually Magnum offers to, I will give you my title shot against Junkyard Dog. 2 slaps him in the face right on TV. And you should have seen the crowd when this happened. Everyone was stunned. And eventually 2 gets to the match against Junkyard Dog, wins the North American title, and is a full-fledged heel. And it gets even better. he says, I'm not number 2 at anything. I'm Mr. Wrestling 1. My new protege is Mr. Wrestling 2. It's Hercules Hernandez in a Mr. Wrestling 2 suit. Well, TA eventually wins the feud, and Mr. Wrestling 2, who is now Hercules Hernandez, is getting a title shot against, I think it was Magnum TA, and Mr. Wrestling 1, who is Mr. Wrestling 2, comes out, asks for the title shot, and Hercules Hernandez beats him mercilessly, which means that Magnum was the one who really showed loyalty, and he's really the good guy, and 2 took on some creep who was totally disloyal and got what he deserved. Bix, your thoughts on Magnum versus 2, the big feud?
It's the best mentor-protege feud in the history of wrestling. There's nothing else like it. No one's ever really tried to repeat it. Like, there have been other feuds with that general underlying story, but nothing really like that one. It just works so well. I mean, in large part because Wrestling 2 was such a miserable prick on promos, like that he's this grumpy old asshole, and it just worked because, it worked, in partly because of the whole the best heels are the ones who think they're the baby faces thing. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily something you'd agree with, but you can see the whole thought process for every single move he makes.
Oh, I mean, I totally agree with the idea that the best heels are the ones who really genuinely think they are in the right and they're just getting screwed. That's true in life. It is.
Exactly. And Magnum TA was, also just legitimately as a worker improving at a fast rate at that same time and as a promo. And because of his specific appeal, too, as this kind of ruggedly handsome, tough sort of everyman, was the perfect foil for for 2 as well, because, kind of for the reason you said, that he ends up going with this disloyal idiot in Hernandez, and it just makes Magnum look even better as this just kind of earnest guy doing the right thing.
Yes.
And it's just perfect. And also, I think this is a good opportunity, too, to mention that Hercules Hernandez, because of how most of his WWF run went, has become very underrated historically.
I agree. Hernandez, when he was in Mid-South in like 84, when he was in Florida in 85 as well, looked like he really could be the next big thing. And it just never worked out for him in the WWF, at least not at that level.
No, but he could work. He was a fun promo. And I think part of it is that the most prominent parts of his WWF run were as a babyface, and he just wasn't really a good babyface.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the times he's a heel in the WWF, he's really not bad in the ring. He's not really getting to do the promos the way he did in Mid-South, but he could still go pretty well. It's just that wasn't a good fit as babyface, his style. Although the one match him and Paul Roma had as a team as babyfaces before they became Power Glory, that was on Primetime Wrestling. It's on YouTube. They actually had good chemistry as a babyface team too, although they were very they were looking like they were polishing up their supplementation regimen to get that push. If you've never seen this, people who are listening, look that match up, because Hercules looks like he can't lift his arms above his head. He's so jacked up. But he's able to move still too. It's actually fairly impressive. And that's a team too, as heels, that should have gotten a better run. I guess just timing wise, as far as that they were going to bring in the Nasty Boys and give them more of a push, that they didn't get more. But yeah, Hercules in that era between the Mid-South run, the Crockett run as Assassin 2, he was really, really good, and he fit in well as kind of as the number 2 for Wrestling 2. Which I didn't mean to say that way.
No, that's all right. No, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, summer of '84, Mid-South, you had so many guys who had physiques. I mean, they looked like they were going to explode. Hercules was one of them. Buddy Landel was another guy. And you might say Buddy Landel. Yeah, Buddy Landel looked like the Michelin Man, for crying out loud. One of the best things about Mid-South in general was Bill Watts had such attention to detail when it came to the storylines. I think that really got underlined here because, again, you have Mr. Wrestling 2 as this incredibly grouchy old man, and he just brings in this knucklehead, Hercules Hernandez. We didn't know it was him yet. And, he gave up a very loyal guy, Magnum, for this unloyal guy. And it wasn't just that storyline. It was every storyline that Watts. I mean, sometimes he introduced too much detail and made things a little bit complicated. But I think I'd rather have that than the guy who just doesn't pay attention to his own booking. Anyway, another thing that happened in Mid-South, and by the way, Mid-South was down in 1983 and rebounded to have a huge 1984 based on a couple of new acts that came in and started feuding with each other. And these acts were still having matches in 1990. And in some effect, we're still having matches in 1994. We're talking about the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express. Bix, have you seen the first appearance of the Rock and Roll Express in Mid-South Wrestling?
I think I have refreshed my memory on what it was.
They had introduced them through videos, video montages for a couple of weeks before they debuted. When they first set foot in the ring at the Irish McNeil Boys Club, in that ring, I mean, the crowd was wild for them. It was like a Beatles concert. The girls were going crazy. They hadn't even been there yet. And it just goes to show, like, if you pick the right act and you introduce them the right way, that you're going to make money. And I have been told that the Rock and Roll Express, I mean, were a major, major draw in Mid-South from the moment that they got there. I mean, first of all, your thoughts on the Rock and Roll. This is early Rock and Roll Express, Mid-South, 1984.
They were like nothing that had been in that territory before. And that's really, I mean, that's what Dundee was bringing as the booker, especially that he had the eye for that. And he also had the right wrestlers for that too. That he was doing a little bit of what World Class had, but bringing in younger fans, both, younger guys and especially younger female fans, because he was bringing the Rock and Rolls and Terry Taylor and knew the way to push them, in part because he had been pushed that way himself to appeal especially to female fans. And that was not a territory that had ever really done anything like that. It was, the hard-nosed Bill Watts style we think of when we think of Mid-South. And I mean, really is a credit to Dundee and Watts working together that it clicked so quickly, I think, that they did not have an adjustment period. This isn't Dusty going to Crockett.
No, it isn't. And I mean, Watts has talked about, he had a meeting with Jerry Jarrett, trying to get Jarrett and Lawler's input as to why business was down. Mm-hmm. And, Watts said, and Lawler and Jarrett told him, if the girls are going to be there, the guys are going to follow the girls, and you don't have anything for the girls. And he's like, you've got a locker room that would take on the entire city, but you don't have any draws for the girls. And that's when they brought in the Rock and Roll Express and Terry Taylor. And to say that it worked is an understatement. So, all right. So that was, now you're also bringing in, and this is the end of 1983, Jim Cornette. And he's got the Midnight Express together. Condrey and Eaton may be the best in-ring working team of all time. And if you have not seen Mid-South Jim Cornette, some of it's on WWE Network. Go out of your way to see it, because I really think if I had to pick 1 year of one manager, this is the best ever, it would be Jim Cornette in 1984, because he wasn't trying to be funny. He was just like this nasty little mama's boy. And like Bill Watts said, you just want to slap him. And I mean, your thoughts on Mid-South Jim Cornette, summer of 84, Bix?
he's Memphis Cornette, but with the confidence that he needed to be a major league manager.
Good point.
He's not, like you said, he's not trying to be funny. And there were ways in which he could tell some of the jokes and the insults and still be a heel. So, I mean, he shouldn't necessarily be entirely criticized for that. And it did fit better in Crockett than something like that would have fit in Mid-South. But no, that is when he's at his best overall, because it's the smarmiest and just the most slappable he ever was in Mid-South. Like, yes. He's just so easily, he's just so good in that role there. And I mean, it's funny in a way that the promoter is, his pretty much their first major program in the territory, but Watts was also the perfect foil for that version of Jim Cornette. So I don't think you can blame Watts for doing that program at all, especially with how well it did.
No, not at all. It was a great program when they had Bill Watts. I mean, the angle that they did where the Midnight Express came out and Dennis Condrey had a flapjack and they just knocked Bill Watts out a couple of weeks, or I think it was the week after he put Jim Cornette's face in a cake. And, and it was one of those things. Watts was interviewing Butch Reed, and the Midnight Express came out and they attacked Bill Watts, and they just laid him out cold. And Butch Reed sees this going on. Reed's a heel, and he looks at it and he walks away. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with this.
Yes, and this just hit me. I don't think I ever really thought about this before. I think one of the things that made the Midnights work so well, particularly in Mid-South, not, obviously not like they didn't in Crockett. I feel like Eaton has more of a killer instinct as a heel in Mid-South than he does later.
That is a good point. As a matter of fact, I think that goes for Condrey as well.
Yeah, I think I would say that too. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just that after getting into the routine with the rock and rolls that they kind of felt more obligated to have a flashier, smooth tag team match or something.
Maybe.
But Mid-South, like Cornette, is, I think, when they're at their most believable and effective as heels.
I agree. And you brought something up. Like, I saw Jim Cornette on WTBS in 1985, and I thought he was funny. And I liked him. I enjoyed the act. It was so different in Mid-South, which I hadn't seen yet in 1985. It was the same Jim Cornette. It wasn't the same Jim Cornette. It was like a really dark version of Jim Cornette, and there was nothing funny going on. Like, if he said something that was an insult, it was like highly insulting. It wasn't funny. Like, I remember he said, I forget what he said to Boyd Pierce as Boyd Pierce was introducing the Midnight Express, but Boyd just kind of I don't know. He recoiled, and it's like, oh my God, this guy just hurt Boyd Pierce's feelings. I want to kill him.
Yeah, it's like altogether, all three of them just come off as meaner in Mid-South.
Yeah, and again, maybe maybe it was a better fit in Crockett for Jim Cornette to have a little bit of a lighter side, whatever. And I agree with that. But in Mid-South, they were incredibly effective as an act. Also, summer of 1984, Terry Taylor comes in. He gets a big push, wins the TV title. They had a tournament for that title, and he becomes embroiled in a controversy with then babyface Steve Williams, who took possession of the actual medallion itself. Taylor won the title. Yeah, I love this one too. Steve Williams like, oh yeah, well, now that you're the champion, I'll give you the title, no problem. They go on TV the next week. Taylor's like, hey, where's the medallion? And Doc says, I forgot it. And as soon as I saw that, I thought it was fantastic. And of course, the next week, Steve Williams says, if you want the medallion, you're going to have to take it from me. And Dr. Death is a heel. Now, a couple of things to unpack. Williams was always a big favorite of Bill Watts. As a matter of fact, it became obvious as time went on that Bill Watts was building Steve Williams into what was going to be Mid-South version of Hulk Hogan. We never reached that finish line. Sold the promotion right before he was going to make that happen. He had been a big football star at the University of Oklahoma, so right there, Watts is going to love him. And he started when Williams started as a wrestler. I mean, he's highly regarded now, and he had a wonderful peak in the ring. But early in his career, Steve Williams was not very good. At this point, he was still learning. He still wasn't that good. But I think he needed to be a heel as part of his progression as, building your superstar. I mean, what are your thoughts on Steve Williams turning in summer of 1984, but Steve Williams overall in 1984?
I mean, you're right. Like, as a babyface, he's kind of just, until that initial heel turn, he's kind of Edgar Boo Thomas with a better push.
Good point.
Like, there's not that much there. He needed to have that time as a heel, getting a better idea of how he was going to have that killer instinct to become Steve Dr. Death Williams. And this is going to sound kind of weird, but I feel like this is one of those cases where it's kind of true. Doc also feels like one of those wrestlers who was better on steroids.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially we're talking the 80s or 90s. I mean, you got to have the bulk. Let's just be honest.
Well, he was already bulky, but he wasn't scary yet until he became the jacked up Steve Williams. Even though we should have, if you knew about him, you would be scared of him, but you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean. I mean, yeah, and it was a little bit surprising that they did it at the time. But like I said, turning heel really can be part of the development of your next superstar babyface. Also, I mean, just looking at Steve Williams overall, tell me what you think of this. I always thought once you got Watts out of the picture, now you don't have another Oklahoma offensive lineman running the show. Long term, I always thought Steve Williams was a poor choice to be a babyface. Like, let's say in the NWA 88, 89. Yeah, he was a heel for a while, but even that was, as part of the varsity club, I didn't think that was the best move. I think they should have first of all, they should have given him Jim Cornette as a manager while we're speaking about Jim. And secondly, they should have turned him into the American version of, sort of an American version of Bruiser Brody, but also kind of like this obnoxious, overprivileged jock let's throw in the word dumb here, a dumb, overprivileged jock who is now a pro wrestler. And boy, is this guy an asshole. But what do you think, Bix?
I think there were times where he was effective as a babyface, but it seemed like that was only when he was playing off of other baby faces. Like him and Dibiase were a great heel team, but they were pretty good as a babyface team too. He was a fairly effective babyface in '89 when he's playing off of the Midnights and the Road Warriors. But when he's on his own, something's missing. And I don't know what it is. Like, it's if he's with someone else. And granted, we're talking about some incredibly other talented wrestlers there and some huge stars, but it's just something about him that he seemed more likable if he was around friends. And I don't know what it is, but I think that held him back as far as a singles babyface, even though, hell of a worker and Mid-South, especially great fit is kind of the new Watts, both two sport guys from University of Oklahoma. And, he had Watts' finisher for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Like, he was the new Watts, and it didn't really click the way it should have. And by the way, did they do an angle or anything where Watts gave him the Oklahoma Stampede, or did he just kind of start using it?
Oh, I've never seen that angle if it ever happened. I think he just started using it.
I wonder if Watts should have, with hindsight, if it would have worked out better if he endorsed him.
You know what? I agree with that, actually. I agree that it might have been better. Once Steve Williams turned babyface again, by the way, I thought his his babyface turn was really cool. And the turn, it was such a simple turn. Dick Murdoch has injured Ted DiBiase, and Steve Williams is Ted DiBiase's friend. He's not turning his back on him.
Well, it wasn't just that. It was also that the thing where him and Rick Steiner came upon the car accident and saved the people from the burning car happened around the same time.
Yes, it did.
Now, granted, they didn't turn Rick Steiner, but it was such a great story, and it was real, that you had this guy yanking a car door off its hinges to save these people from a burning car, that along with the fact that he's backing up his friend who turned anyway, it was perfect.
No, you know what? I had forgotten about that, and you're right. That did happen right around the same time. Also, I think right around the same time, he took an elbow from Brad Armstrong and got stiffed and wound up getting like 110 stitches. So all kinds of happy sort of coincidences are happening for Steve Williams around now.
Right. It was, I believe it was definitely a double shot day. I don't remember if it was a Tulsa, Oklahoma City day. And then he just came back and worked the second show.
Okay. All right, moving to Florida. Now, Florida in 1983 was showing some signs of they were slowing down. I think this goes back to right around spring of 83. The crowds started to shrink. And, I mean, this happens to a lot of promotions. They rebound. Florida was not rebounding in 1984. And the biggest story maybe in the history of the promotion was that Dusty Rhodes, who had been the mainstay babyface since, I want to say 1974, was leaving 10 years later. And Florida without Dusty Rhodes, boy, that's I mean, it had to happen someday. But that was going to be a tough day, and that tough day happened in 1984. Bix, your thoughts on Dusty hitting the highway?
I think it's as much that he took so much of the crew with him, because that wasn't really something that was happening in wrestling anymore. I mean, people would leave when a bookers changed over, but not a wholesale sort of Buddy Rogers type of thing with taking – Wyndham, Rotunda, Long Riders, JJ. Was that it, or am I forgetting anyone?
Did he take Billy Jack Haynes with him? Or did Billy stay?
Billy, oof. Because I'm trying to remember when his actual short run with Crockett proper is. I don't know if he took Haynes with him or not.
All right.
But yeah, he's taking so many key guys, though, at the same time, and the promotion has to kind of change course very quickly, and it's I don't know if you'd call it the beginning of the end, but it's not. They were not really able to ever really find their footing again after Dusty left, even in the better periods.
No, they were not. And as far as the beginning of the end, I would say, if the beginning of the end hadn't started in 83, it was definitely right there when Dusty left, because let's say you're running Florida, summer of 84, Dusty leaves. Who do you replace him with? Oh, Barry Windham. Oh, Barry's going with him. Now who do you have left? And that's the thing. Dusty had centered so much of Florida around himself. And you can't say he was wrong, because he had a hell of a run in Florida. And it was 10 years. And maybe that was starting to come to an end organically on its own. Maybe it was time to have someone new at the top of the card. The problem is they didn't have that someone in place. Like, not even Barry Windham, I think, really. Maybe they could have transitioned to Windham, but it doesn't matter. Barry Windham was gone. Now you've got Billy Jack, who was red hot in 1984, believe it or not. But could you use him as a top guy in a major promotion? Maybe, maybe not. Now you've got Mike Graham as a main eventer. I probably think more of Mike Graham than the average person listening to this. For whatever, I think Mike Graham gets a bad rap in the internet wrestling community or whatever you want to call it. Mike Graham was really good. I bought Mike Graham as a contender, a legit contender for the NWA title when I got wrestling on, Florida wrestling on cable TV up here. But now it's 1984, and Mike Graham's your top babyface isn't going to cut it. And, well, Bix, like you said, it was kind of the beginning of the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, he hadn't really ever been booked as the top babyface before anyway. He would be in a tag team with his dad or with Steve Kern or whoever. And he's getting older. He doesn't really look quite the same. And wrestling's changing. And even though he could work and he fit in his own way in that promotion in his dad's territory, in the, in a mid-'80s wrestling promotion, especially one that had been really remade by Dusty, if he had a window, it had long since passed to be able to be the top guy in the territory.
I agree with that. And there might have been a window like maybe late 70s. I mean, when I saw him against Dory Funk Jr., which was the top program at one point in like early 81, like I totally bought him as the top guy. But you're right, wrestling had changed a lot and would continue to change. And if one channel has Hulk Hogan as the top guy and you've got Mike Graham as your top guy, you've got a problem.
Right. And also someone like Dory, at least, is a great fit for him. Like he at least could pull it off if he had a foil that worked in a specific way with Mike Graham. Yeah. But you don't have that in 84.
That's true. And now I'm thinking about, okay, who else could they have replaced Dusty with? Oh, well, Jack Briscoe, that would be a Band-Aid. Oh, Briscoe's gone to the WWF. Hey, how about turn Don Morocco into a babyface? No, Morocco's gone to the WWF. So they all were already having a lot of problems, and then they get dealt this body blow of losing Dusty, Wyndham, etc. More on Florida. There's an expression in wrestling where if you put something out there and it doesn't get over, you've got two choices. Number one, you kill it, or number two, you turn up the volume on it. And this is what they did with Kevin Sullivan, who had been using a pretty outrageous gimmick in Florida in 1983. I think it was more than strongly suggested that he was a devil worshiper, and he was doing all kinds of occult stuff in 83, and the crowds went down, and maybe it was at least partially because of that. I think let's face it, there are going to be some people who are turned off by an angle like that and are going to stay home, and maybe not enough people are turned on enough by it. But by summer of 84, Sullivan, now he's the booker, and he has turned up the heat on this angle. He is coming to the ring with about 6 other people, one of whom is Nancy Sullivan, basically in her underwear, some guy with a snake, all these dudes with makeup all over their faces. Bob Roop comes in with half his head shaved, and the crowds didn't go up. And I thought that, doubling down on this angle was a mistake. Bix, what are your thoughts?
It clearly didn't work as box office. I mean, there's some of it. If you look back at like some of those compilations, a lot of it is entertaining in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. Although most of the stuff that you see grouped together, like in the compilations, is the second run, the like 85, 86 stuff. But no, you're right. It just didn't click, and there probably was a territory that could have worked in. And I don't know which one it would have been, but it didn't click there. Even though like he did interesting stuff. There were interesting angles and cool promos. I mean, a lot of weird promos that didn't make any sense either, but he just wasn't effective. And, you think you've talked about, how in the past, like how enjoyable the Mike Davis is the real Dusty Rhodes thing is.
That was fun.
But again, it didn't it was fun, but it didn't really make any kind of difference.
Exactly.
If it was part of a story where Dusty was coming back to get, revenge and send Kevin Sullivan out of the territory for good, maybe, but it just, was kind of a reminder that Dusty was gone.
Yeah.
And I get why Sullivan did it and thought it would be the thing to go with too, if that makes sense.
No, I get that. I mean, I think you put it really well. It was entertaining in a vacuum, but as far as like having to go out there and draw money every night, it was just the wrong thing to do. I'm sorry.
It just wasn't the right fit for that territory.
Yeah, I wonder if that would have gotten over anywhere, to be honest. I mean, as soon as, Sullivan came to Crockett, like near the end of 83, he didn't last there. And he way, way toned down that entire angle. Both he and Mark Lewin went up and had Gary Hart as their manager. And, just Crockett wasn't having any part of that.
No. That would not have gone over well in that part of the country.
Yeah, exactly. All right, moving on to the AWA, which was still a big deal coming into 1984 and in the summer of 1984. Rick Martel, now, Nick Bockwinkel had been champion since 1975. It was working, but from where I was sitting, it looked like it was getting old. Bockwinkel loses the title to Jumbo Shiruda, and then Rick Martel wins the AWA title from Shiruda. So you've got Nick Bockwinkel saying, I never lost the belt to Rick Martel with the belt, and you have what looks like a really good feud, at least on paper. Bix, what are your thoughts on, first of all, Martel is AWA champion?
I thought he was a really good choice because he fit that territory, but he was like a more evolved version. He was more athletic, a little flashier, not your most charismatic babyface and not an awesome promo, but for the AWA, he worked quite well. And I don't think enough people realize that AWA still drew just fine with him as champion.
Yes.
The AWA really does not really get into trouble until 86.
No, they don't. They were doing fine. And here's the thing, and I said I kind of wanted to stay away from this, but it seemed like Vince was rating everyone's roster, but it seemed like he took no more joy in rating someone's roster than he did Vern Gagne. I mean, he was after as many AWA guys as he could get his hands on, and yet they still were, like you said, were doing fine until right around summer of 86.
Yeah, I mean, 85, they're really still doing quite well. 86, they're still doing well in some places. I think it was Salt Lake and some of the other Rockies markets they were still doing quite well in. And then eventually it kind of really, once they kind of lose just about everyone as far as the money guys, in 86 is when things really start going downhill. But, Martel really should get more credit for that EWA title run because he drew well, had great matches, was able to draw well with guys maybe you wouldn't even think would be drawing AWA title challengers like Jimmy Garvin. I think overall it's a big positive mark for him, and it worked pretty well in the context of that territory too.
I am in complete agreement. I thought he was a good choice. I think they could have used him better. But I thought he was, he had a history of being in the AWA. He was there like 81, 82. Do I have my years right? Maybe not. I think he was there from like 82, 83.
It was something like that. Yeah. And he teamed with Tito Santana some for the first time. And they were a hell of a tag team too, even then.
Okay. So, yeah, I liked the choice. I think the AWA could have done it better. But, like you said, Rick Martel deserves a lot of credit. And he was a good choice for tag team for the singles championship. Now, the tag team championships, on the other hand, in May were won by the Crusher and Baron Von Rashke, who at this point combined were more than 100 years old. That came from Sean Goodwin. I remember I remember reading in the magazines that they had won the titles, and I couldn't roll my eyes back into my head far enough. I mean, Crusher, when I first started reading the wrestling magazines in 76, he was teamed with Bruiser. They were the AWA Tag Team Champions. And I bought it. I was like, okay, these two older barroom brawlers get together and they're the tag team champions. Now we are a full 8 years later, and Crusher had been in and out of retirement. He had been part-time, and now you're giving him the responsibility of not only being one of the tag team champions, but being one of the tag team champions with Baron Von Rashke. And I like Von Rashke, but as we have pointed out, wrestling was changing, and one station has Hulk Hogan as its top guy, and Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson are their tag team champions, and your tag team champions are Crusher and Von Rashke. Bix, your thoughts?
I think, and nothing against Baron too, but I think the specific combination ages Crusher in the way that other partners wouldn't have.
Good point.
Because Baron, and Baron's not even that. How old is he then?
I would say mid 40s, maybe late 40s.
Let me look this up real quick, because now I'm curious, because he's still active for quite a while after that. Okay, let's see. Baron Von Rashke. He was born. Do I have to actually click to the Wikipedia article to see this? It looks like I do. Okay, he was born. Okay, so he is in the summer. He is not quite 44 yet. So he's about the same age then that AJ Styles is now.
That's wild.
He looks much older than that,
to say the least.
And Crusher is aged too, he has to be a good bit older than Von Rashke, I would think, because he had been wrestling since the mid 50s.
Yeah. If they're over 100 years old combined, that means that he is at least 56, and I'll bet he's older than that. I bet he's closer to 60 at this point. So talk about wrestling changing.
Oh God, yes, he was born July 11th, 1926. So he's 58.
Egads. Okay. So you got a 58-year-old and Baron Von Rashke as your tag team champions. I'm all for nostalgia, but that's going a little bit crazy. But then
he's 15 years older. But Von Rashke, just because of the type he was, if you had not necessarily Dick the Bruiser, but that kind of type in with him still, I think it keeps the mystique more than Von Rashke does, even though Von Rashke's 15 years younger.
I agree. I totally agree. At least it would have made sense. Crusher and a young guy would have made sense. A Tommy Rich type like they tried to do in 1979. But I agree, this tag team, I remember opening the magazine, seeing that they were the tag team champions, being like, oh my God, come on. But then they overcompensate perhaps by going in a complete opposite direction. The still green and completely nuked up Road Warriors come in and win the AWA tag team titles in August. Bix, your thoughts on the Road Warriors in the AWA?
If they're coming home to work for the AWA, you got to make them the champions, I think. Because
I would think so too.
They're by far the most over, on a national basis, they're the most over tag team in the business because they've become a touring attraction and stuff. And I think, especially given their style, not necessarily being an AWA style, they had, how do I put this? They were not, you had your brawler types like Crusher, but the Road Warriors were kind of different. I think they fit in well for people you might not think would fit in well in the AWA. I think overall, their run there went pretty well. And outside of some of the issues they had with roughing people up in the ring or getting roughed up, I think their run went pretty well, about as well as could be expected.
Yeah, I mean, the AWA needed someone who was a legitimate draw, and that was the Road Warriors. And I'm speculating here, but I'm thinking the Road Warriors probably got to write their own check, so to speak, as far as coming in. I mean, they could have gone anywhere at this point. I'm certain, and I'm sure as part of the deal to lure them in, they were offered the AWA tag team titles. Okay, before we run out of time, let's talk a little bit about Georgia. We kind of wanted to stay away from the War of '84 part of this, but let's be honest, this promotion was absolutely, atomic bombed by Black Saturday. I am actually, to this day, I am surprised that Ole was able to kind of pick up the pieces and continue in syndication with the Championship Wrestling from Georgia show, and getting that. I don't see how a promotion can really survive promoting in Atlanta with a 6:05 in the morning spot, I think it was, or 7 in the morning spot on WTBS. But they're still in the game. Their top feud was still Ted Dibiase and Ron Garvin on top, which is, certainly a respectable feud. On the other hand, they're using guys like Ole Anderson, Brad Armstrong, and Bob Roop in main events. I'm not trying to be insulting towards any of those guys. I think Ole was too old to be main eventing in 1984, especially when he had spent the last few years as the co-host with Gordon Soley. Brad Armstrong, I just don't think is a main eventer in a major promotion. Nothing against Brad. Bob Roop, there's a reason why he wasn't a consistent main eventer. Bix, any thoughts from you on Georgia in summer of 1984?
Like you said, I think they pick up the pieces about as well as can be expected. Especially when you consider the TV time slot and being able to make something of it. But it very quickly ceases to have the air of anything resembling a major promotion.
No.
Once DiBiase's gone, it's not just on him, but it just feels like once he's gone, that's kind of the end of it being anything more than this kind of slapdash thrown together favor to Ole that it was.
I agree with you. I actually think that Ted Dibiase in the fall of 1983 gave Georgia the well-needed shot in the arm that he provided. And once he was gone, it was like, he was the last guy that you're like, okay, this guy is a real major league talent. A main eventer wherever he goes. And once he dropped out, forget it. Just to give a little perspective, I remember the early days of that Saturday show, and they were promoting as a main event Ole Anderson and Thunderbolt Patterson, and the 1984 version of Thunderbolt Patterson had to be seen to be believed. They brought in Jimmy Hart, who was one of the funniest managers I've ever seen, and he just took such a shot at Ole and Thunderbolt. He comes out and he goes, "Look at these guys. This is 1984, not 1954." And I laughed so hard because it looked so true. It looked like these were two guys who were out wrestling in 1954 and doing a wonderful job, but here it is 30 years later and they're old men. But wait, it's Ole and Thunderbolt against the New York Assassins. This is the main event at the Omni. And, it was just pathetic. But anyway, I'm glad we were able to get all of this in. David Bixenspan, thank you very much for coming on. Before we sign off, is there anything that you would like to plug? I'd like to thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Do you think to plug that I didn't plug last week? Follow me on Twitter at David Bix. Should be able to follow everything I do from there. But, also, can see all my articles and stuff linked over there. And then also I have at Babyface v Heel, or also babyfaceversusheel.com articles I do there, research and reporting, and including the stuff I'm doing about the steroid trials, which that's part of the pay tier, but a lot of free stuff. And then if you want to help support it and the work I'm doing, you can do the paid tier, which is $5 a month or $50 a year. And you get access to the exclusive stuff that's only behind the paywall, like most of the steroid trial stuff will be.
Very cool. Hey, David, sincerely, thank you for coming on in the last couple of weeks. We have every intention of Sean Goodwin being back with us next week, unless I do something stupid with my work schedule. That's exactly what's going to happen. I also want to thank our producer, Luke Kippelman, who does so much behind the scenes for this show. He doesn't get enough credit. And this has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network. We will see you next week. Go Vols.